Welcome back. So a lot of you have been waiting on this, and I know that because you've told me so. I get a lot of people commenting in person and on the post, when's the Willies going to get done? When's the Willies going to get done? Well, we've actually been waiting on parts. We just got a new set of head gaskets in, which I needed, and the transmission just arrived last week. We've been waiting on a transmission, so we've got a new transmission, a new power glide and converter from Gearstar. So they built us what we need and what we want and what it used to have, basically. It's just a hot rod power glide. I've already got the adapter for it. It's already had a power glide behind it. But Speedway Automotive has sent a bunch of parts. So we've got a new battery from Speedway. We got a new air-motive fuel pump from Speedway. What else? I mean, a lot of smaller parts like new tail lights because they were getting rusty sitting around here. I can't remember. We'll get into that.
Tubes.
Huh?
Tubing.
Oh yeah, new headers. I'm actually excited about that. So the headers that I built for this back when I built the car, I'll show you here. I forgot about the headers. I'm looking forward to doing it. This is what I built for it. So this one happens to be this side. So just a typical zoomy, big tube header. I used to always think bigger was better. This is a 2.5 inch header. We don't need 2.5 inch. So the new ones are 2.25 inch, which will actually look more period right. And I'm gonna do them like I should have. Back when I did those, I didn't know what I was gonna do with the car. NHRA requires that you turn your zoomies, 45 degrees, blah, blah, blah. I kind of built them by what the NHRA said. Wipe that out, I don't care. This is gonna be a copy of Stonewoods and Cook's headers. And I'm gonna do them out of smaller tube, which looks better. And they're gonna be, I don't like this part of it. They're gonna aim at the ground. So they blow dust terrible, but I want them for the nostalgia and the period correct. So Speedway sent us U-bins and tubing, polished, I'm not sure it's polished, stainless steel anyway. I don't care if it's polished. We'll probably Scotch-Brite it, but it'll be stainless steel headers. So they'll look much better for the car. I never did like those. They bothered me. They came out from under the fenders, and that was just one of the things that I just didn't like about the car. I just pulled the front cover off, so we pulled the blower hub off. No problems there. I actually had this off before. I'd forgot when we first started this project back. I had taken the camshaft out and sent it to Nolan at Iski, and he actually reground it. He changed it. This cam always had a little more lift than I felt comfortable with, and he agreed. So he lowered the lift and did something with the duration. I'm not real sure, but cam's back and ready to go. I had taken this off. It's got the nice gear drive in the front. It is a 3900 stroke. It says right there on the stamped in that really pretty billet crank. These are MGP rods. It's got Program is the name of the company, Program main caps. So it's got splayed 4-bolt main caps. It's got 4 bolts here, 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 and there. No, that's 2. I guess that's still 2. Front and rear are still 2-bolt main, but they're billet steel caps instead of cast caps. A lot of times the guys would leave the stock front and rear cap on it. And, you know, the old alcohol motors and even fuel motors, they'd leave the stock front and main cap, rear, which was a cast iron cap, and they'd put a lot of times an aluminum 4-bolt main cap in the center. This has got steel, billet steel 4-bolt main caps in the center and on the 2 bolts on the ends. So it's got that. That's nice stuff. And then it's got, I think these are Venolia pistons, if I remember right. I've got a spare or 2, and a Titan oil pump. This thing's been in here for, I don't know now, what, 15 years probably.
Probably.
Something close to that. So I'm getting ready to take the oil pump out. We'll take this girdle off. You can see what I did here many years ago, and it's been redone so many times. The lower part is really pretty ugly, but this all bolts to the block, and then I've got these cross bolts. I didn't need 2 bolts. I've done the same basic girdle to the big block in the 55, but I just used 1 bolt. So these caps in the center, you can see here, they're machined out of steel. I made these as well, and they fit down over the top of these billet steel program main caps, and they clamp down with the same bolts, the same studs, and then they bolt to the pan out here or the girdle. So it just gives it a real rigid hold from side to side here to keep that main cap from walking, and it's always seemed to work the time that I ran the motor. But it's got some nice parts in it. Okay, we got the girdle off. No surprises there. I'm gonna pop these rod caps off. I've already pulled number 1 and number 2 out. It's kind of funny. The rod's so wide. That is tight. 105 pounds. Kind of funny here though. This rod is so big. This is the same rod we use in the 55 for 3 times the power. Gotta get that bearing insert out. I dropped it down in the cam tunnel, but so far, look at that bearing. That's like still like new. Still got the coating on it. That looks great there. But this is what I was getting at. The rod is nearly as big as the piston. It just, look at that. It just does fit in the bore. These little bitty tiny pistons. Let me see if I got a calculator. I think it's 4060 if I remember right. It's been a long time. 4030. So 4030 is a bore on that thing. That's the same as a 350 Chevy 4-inch. So little bitty bore. They're actually a small block. That's a little bitty block, but it's got those big giant overweight heads on there. But back in the day, you know, back in the late 50s and through the 60s, even into the 70s, these old antique Hemis were still making big power. By the time I was into hot rodding, we kind of laughed at them. We wouldn't. I've got a motor that down in my other shop that's one that a guy came up and said, I got a Hemi. Of course, I was all excited, and then he showed me that. It's like, that's not a Hemi, that's a pile of junk. Well, by today's standards, that makes not much horsepower. You can make that much out of a stock little nothing LS motor with a turbo on it. But back in the day, this was a bad boy. And they did make a lot of power. I don't know what the fuel motors actually made, a couple thousand horsepower, probably. You know, these alcohol motors were around 1,000 horsepower. Maybe a little bit more, but not much. It's honestly way overbuilt for the horsepower that it delivers. But it looks like everything's coming out. The bearings are all good so far. That's a beauty. Man, I like the smell of it. The oil reminds me of back when we used to run this car. It's got alcohol in it and you can smell it, and I would run grape scent in it a lot back then. And I still smell it in the oil. The oil still looks like new, just like that bearing. So fortunately, all I think I'm gonna have to do is put it back together. I got the block apart. Everything looks perfect, even the paint inside. There was a lot of places in here that didn't even look like it ever had oil on it. But I took it outside and washed it, pressure washed it with some soap and some pressure wash. And I wasn't out there honestly, when that was wet, I probably wasn't out there 5 minutes. And look at the ice. That's what my hands feel like. The ice formed on that rod while I was out there. It's cold in Arkansas right now. It's surprisingly cold, but I think this weekend maybe 60, is that right? Or 70s?
Sundays, around 60.
Just 60? So the first of the week, wasn't there a 70 in there somewhere?
Tuesday, I think.
So like they say, if you don't like the weather, stick around a few minutes, it'll change. I guess that's everywhere, but this is unseasonably cold for us right now. And that thing's dripping with cold ice. But I'm going to take the motor mounts off. I made these motor mounts that bolt in the stock location instead of using a motor plate. I was gonna try to not pull it apart. The only thing I really have to do is this deck is just so rough. The guy that surfaced this, you could honestly do that with a bastard file and do as good a job. So I'm gonna take it apart. I'm either gonna put it in the mill and surface it with the mill, or I may make a deck plate and sand it. I know some of you are probably cringing at the thought of that, but it'll be okay. So the solution I've come up with for this really bad deck surface, some of you are going to cringe. It's okay. You can cringe. I've got this really nice piece of granite. I'm going to take some upholstery glue and I'm going to glue 2 sheets of sandpaper. So that's going to be a very flat, accurate surfacing block. And I'm going to put it up here and just work it back and forth till I take those grooves out of that block. They make a plate, and I've used it before, like at a racetrack. If you have a surface problem, they make a plate with handles, and you put sandpaper on that, called a lapping plate. So you can actually lap a cylinder head. We've done it on a cylinder head on drag week one time, and the guy actually won his class the next day. We stayed up all night fixing a cylinder head, welding it, lapping it back in with a lapping plate. So this will be fine for this blown dry alcohol Hemi. I'm just going to sand that down, but you can keep a watch on me here. So I'm going to glue this sandpaper on. This will have to dry because it's basically contact cement. I've done this before on my big steel table there. I just coated my sandpaper with glue because it thinks it needs to turn inside out. Holy cow. I kept a piece of that sandpaper glued to that table for several years. And I would use it for anything like surfacing a exhaust, like a header flange. And it worked. I just wore the sandpaper out and I took it off. So that just needs to dry. Let's get it dry and we'll come back. Okay, let's stick a piece on here. This is an old sand belt that somebody gave me a long time ago. And it was brand new, but the glue on in fact, the piece just blew off on the floor. The glue that glues it together gave up. So they throw them away. Well, it's good for me. It's just a big piece of emery cloth. All right, so that's glued down. I'm gonna wrap the ends. I've got to get this glue off of the belt. Spray can of blue Dykem, but I'm going to use this brush and coat it with Dykem. I don't think I'll have any problem seeing what I'm doing, but okay, I put some gasoline on there and a wire brush, and it came off pretty good. I do feel a little bit of a bump. I want to knock that down. I should have left a little gap in there, I suppose, but a gap or a bump is, either one's equally bad. I could turn the block sideways. Okay, that got rid of it. That's nice and straight. What I don't want to do is run it back and forth and cut a groove down the center of that block. That is not light. I think I'll run it this way. Actually, I'm going to run it diagonally. I like it like that because it's longer. It doesn't have to go as far. I wish my engine stand had brakes.
It does.
Yeah. 2 foot.
No, it's got locks on the wheels.
Oh, it does. Let's put them on. Does it have them on that end?
No.
Maybe that'll work. All right, so we can see already just what we're talking about. Man, I can already tell that's flatter. That took the high spots off. So look right there. It's smooth. And over here, you can see spots where it's smooth. I suppose that could come because the engine's been run with the deck crappy like that. And the head bolts have probably pulled the deck up a little bit. Almost there. We stopped and had a Coke and collected some art that came. Her art came in a 18-wheeler. I don't know what it is. It's something for her house.
That's a picture of the 55 at Uncle Sam. But then I also got a poster that I bought at Barrett Jackson.
Yeah, a poster of 32s on the dry lakes maybe.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is almost done. So Alex came over and I was just showing her. It's just so good. This block is certified within 1/10,000th of an inch of being perfectly flat. So I think that's accurate enough for the top of this motor.
So it's more accurate than what it was.
Yeah. And as long as you go off each end, each time I make a pass, it'll be the same. So if you worked right in the middle and didn't come to the ends every time, you could carve a hole in the middle. But I'm going back and forth off the end. So that's one of my new favorite tools. Now if I can just figure out,
That's really big.
I need somebody that can do it. Don't push it off on my toes. Yeah, it's not easy. I don't know what it weighs, but it's at least 50 pounds.
At least you don't have to push down on it.
No, that's the beauty of it. As hard as it is to move, I don't have to push down. And that actually makes it more accurate because you're just using the weight of the block.
Yeah, that way you're not getting uneven pressure.
Yeah, this is my new milling machine.
That's...
Ouch. I just hit my fingers in there. You could take a finger off.
creative.
Before I assemble it, I will clean every... You did it.
I
almost took a pinky off.
felt that thud.
It raised that 40-pound block up. I think that's a 70-pound block.
That hurt.
Okay, we need a flashlight. I started saying I see light and it scared me. It's a hole. It's a bowl hole. So we got the block ready. I just used that wax rag to clean the lint out of the cylinders and the journal saddles. So I honed it. We surfaced it, I honed it. You can see a little bit of cylinder wear. Nothing that I'm worried about. So the deck is now pretty flat. Real flat if you go by the straight edge. There's just a few grooves in a few places. I'm not too worried about that. I'm more concerned about around the cylinders. So that's all done. I'm getting ready to lay the crank. And I didn't even take the rear main seal out. I'm not replacing that because it didn't have a problem. I just wiped the crank. This is the hard chromed crank. Crankshaft specialist did a few years ago, but all those journals, every journal on it was chromed and then built back, so it's built back up and then reground. I just wiped it with a tack rag to get rid of any lint. Here's the bearings. I'm gonna wipe those. Actually, I'm gonna blow them off. Really wipe down in that groove easy. Hemi's got some funny bearings. So the very rear bearing is a wide bearing, but it's not a thrust like on a Chevrolet. Let's see, I scratched into these. This is numero uno. I'm not measuring anything because this thing's been together. It's already been run. I don't have to check any of the clearances because I know it's good. All I'm doing is reassembling it. I only took it apart because I had to do that decking and there was a lot of iron came off of that deck. When I'd blow the sandpaper, it would blow out like dust. I can taste it in my sinuses. So I'm gonna get some assembly lube. I know some people don't like assembly lube or don't use it. I don't know if they don't like it. Kind of sticky and messy, but I prefer it. Give it a little. It strings from one bearing to the next. Kind of honeyish. Get a little on the thrust side of that bearing. That's kind of like an LS or a Ford. Got that thrust in the center. I'm going to put a little bit on the rear main seal too. So the crank is ready to set in. And it's a nice crankshaft. What a beauty. All right, so next step is main caps. I've already cleaned these up. I'm gonna stick them on here and we'll tighten this crank down. Need a little bit of lube on those studs. A little bit under the washer, a little bit on top of the washer. And a little bit where the nuts are. These studs don't have an Allen in the end of them to tighten them down. I'm not actually opposed to that because you can over tighten them if you put an impact or something on them. They're not really supposed to be tight in the block. You don't want to bottom it out in there and crack it. Good morning. Came in this Sunday morning. It's actually almost noon now, but I was able to figure out this morning the exact pushrod length, and I'll show you that process here, kind of. And Nolan's going to order a new set of pushrods Monday, tomorrow. What happened was the lifters that Nolan uses or makes, the seat height in them is 300 thousandths taller than the crane lifters that I used to use. That 300 thousandths means you have to have a shorter push rod by the same equal amount, 300 thousandths. When they got calculated at the plant, it's easy to do. Instead of subtracting 300 thousandths off the push rods, they added 300 thousandths. So now my push rods are essentially 600 thousandths too long, the new ones. Unfortunately, that's a whole pile of push rods. He got spares. But what I did was I put head gasket back on, and the head gasket that we're actually going to be using is thicker. It's an 062. The one that's on here is an 042. I'm okay with that. I did that on purpose because I want to have a little bit more copper that can conform to the deck and the head, plus for the O-ring to squeeze into, and it will lower the compression just a little bit, which is fine because the compression was pretty high on this motor. I don't remember for sure. It was 12 or 12 and a half to 1. I'm pretty sure. So the thicker head gasket's good. I'm using the thinner head gasket for mock-up. Let me zoom this out a little bit. But I put it together with a thinner head gasket, put the rocker arms on one side, put the lifters in, that we'll be using, which are the Iski lifters. And then let me take one of these out. This is the exhaust push rod. Used my Manton adjustable push rod kit, which is a ball on one end, a cup on the other in this case. Long suckers. The unfortunate part with this old antique motor is with this super long push rod, I can't use, the unfortunate part is I can't use a bigger diameter push rod. I'm going to take this nut off because I got to do this one-handed for you guys. Let me spin it around. It's also, get both lifters down, which there they are. It's very close to the head. You can see it down in that hole there. You can't open it up much. It'll get into the water. So you've got a shorter intake push rod, but it's still ginormous. And I used my caliper. Excuse the mess because I'm kind of in a hurry, don't have time, don't want to take the time. I'm just trying to get this thing together. So I've got this one set for the intake push rod. I'm going to put this camera back in the tripod. Got it set for the intake push rod. Oh, actually, I got it set for the... I don't have it set. Okay. I thought it was still set. So I've decided that I want the intake push rod this length. It'll stay in there if you get it just touching. I don't know if you can see it. 10.1 inches exactly is what I'm going to do the intake push rods. The exhaust push rod, this one's a scary one. This thing is going to be 11.250, 11 and a quarter inches long, and it's only a small 3/8 diameter push rod. So that part's kind of, it sucks because you just can't get the strength, the stability in that piece of spaghetti. So you got to balance it out with valve spring pressures. And I made the chrome moly bodies. But what I did is I took a bar stock of chrome moly, and I had it all jigged up and fixtured up and machined them in my old Bridgeport mill. And there's, I guess that's a spare that I made. And then I had them heat treated. The Mantons, the people that make the push rods, helped me, and they advised me rather, on how to heat treat them. So I was able to send them off and have them heat treated, and they ran fine. The geometry's good, everything's good. I just need the new push rods, and I got to figure out what springs I'm going with. I'm about to start on the springs now, but at least the push rods are figured out. I'm going to get that reported to Nolan so he can order those push rods tomorrow. And new rings will be here Tuesday. So what I'll do is put the bottom end together. I'll put the heads on it and everything. I'll just have it ready for new push rods, which is, it's simple with these. You just loosen these locks here, back the adjuster out, slide the rocker arm over, and pull the push rods out. Slide it back over, set your side clearance, tighten it up, adjust the valve, and go. I can have the stands and the rocker arms on the thing ready to go. But it's getting there. So that's what the beast looks like. It's not a beast by any means, 1,000 horsepower. But you got to figure that's 1957. I believe this block, yeah, it's a 57. You see a 5.7. I don't know if it focuses, doesn't matter. That's a 57 block, which is kind of cool in itself, you know, something this old will make 1,000 horsepower on alcohol, not really pushing it. The nitro motors, whatever they made, 2,500 plus, I suppose, on a block that's really kind of scary if you look at it by today's standards. The stuff that I've put in here, the rods, the main caps and what have you, the crank, the pistons are way stronger than this old cast iron block. The old timers said these had a lot of nickel in them and they were hard, but they're not hard by Dart standards or world standards. They may be hard by 1955 Chevrolet standards, but they're certainly not hard. I've done a lot of machining on them, and it's nothing to brag about. So I'm going to get started and get that valve spring figured out. So we're back at it today. Got new rings arrived yesterday, and I guess gapped them this morning. So all the rings are gapped. Everything's ready to go back together. I'm waiting on the push rods from Iski. They had some new push rods made, but I'm going to get the bottom end of this thing put together, and I'm having to kind of relearn. This is something that I haven't worked on in a long time. These little bitty 4-inch pistons feel like a lawnmower to me. So what I do, I didn't bore you with the ring gapping because everybody knows how to gap rings and everybody has an opinion on how to do it. But I do it old school. I've got an electric gapping device, put the ring in and you got a little diamond blade. This is my ring gapping tool. I put a piece of 2x4 in there and file that ring, and I can do such an accurate job and do it fast. Do all 8 cylinders, top and second ring, and usually I end up having to gap the oil rings, but this time the oil rings are right, so I didn't have to gap them. But to gap those by hand with a file, and I can get very accurate. I know you can with your electronic whiz wheel too, and I can as well, but I actually prefer doing it just taking some swipes on the rings. These were, this is a 4040 bore, 40 thousandths over 4 inch. The rings are 40 thousandths over 4 inch plus 5. So they're butted up when they're installed. So I put my desired gap in there. It just takes a few swipes of the file. And I'm putting it back together. So on this Hemi, the pistons are pretty symmetrical, or they are symmetrical. So it'll go in this way or this way. I'm cheating. You can see where the exhaust valve has made contact with the piston once before. One time I was running this thing and I had got out of we had the 07 drag week winter car, the black Camaro. There's a first 7-second street car, and it had a turbo 400 in it, and I was shifting 3 gears on that turbo 400. I jump in the Willies and I go, it's a power glide, so I had first and second, and I clicked it into third gear and it wasn't there. Neutral was, and it over revved this thing and it kissed all the exhaust valves. So that's the way I'm putting it back together, with the pistons with the dents on the top of them down. I know that they're in the right place. And what I like to do, I always use Total Seal rings. That's my go-to ring. They provide you with a paper, and still to this day I use that paper. I like to put the gaps where they tell you to put them. And this one's kind of odd because it's easier to handle the thing without the wrist pin and the rod in. Typically everything that we have, the wrist pin is up in the oil ring. So I have, when I put the oil ring on, it's all retained in there. This one, so old school, the rod's so short, the wrist pin and the buttons, even back in these days I ran buttons, so they'll just fall out. If you turn them over, they'll fall out. So I'm going to put the rings on the pistons without the rods being on there, and I'm going to put one together here. So it says that the oil expander ring gap should be this direction, with that pointing to the front of the engine, and then the bottom rail, which this is the rail, needs to be over here. So I'm going to install the bottom rail. You got to remember the motor's spinning from the front is spinning clockwise, so they, you know, it's only logical to put the ring gaps where they want them, so it just goes oil slinging up on the cylinder wall on that side and more on the pan on this side. So there's the two rail gaps, and then the oil expanders down here. Second ring is the, what do they call it here? They call it a Napier. So the second ring is going to go, second ring gap, second compression ring is going to go with the Napier, which is like a little scratcher. It's got a groove in it that you can see a better picture of it here. I don't have my glasses on. See the little hook on it right there that'll scrape the oil down off of the cylinder wall. They're saying a second ring Napier, or it's also got a dot on top. You can go by that as well. It's going to go up this direction. And the first ring is going to go opposite of that. And this one is what they call a torsional ring. It's got the little corner knocked off of it. That's going to go up on the top ring. So I'm going to put that one up, and the ring gap's going to be down at the 6 o'clock position. And that's good. So I'm going to come over here, gather up my wrist pin, connecting rod. I'm going to put a little bit of assembly lube on that. I know a lot of people use plain oil, and that's fine, whatever you like. Okay, so if this piston is going in like this, we want the big side of the rod with a fillet. See how this has got an angle on it? That's filleted. This side straight down. These two will, the two rods will ride together like this, and the fillet, or the chamfer rather, will go against the fillet in the crankshaft. So the piston goes on this direction. Put the pin buttons in. I'm going to dribble a little bit of engine oil on it. Put a little bit of assembly lube on the bearing that I've already cleaned. Now, let's use our, I've got an expandable ring compressor on this engine because I don't ever do this small of a bore motor, but on my big motors I have machined one-piece tools. I just don't have a reason to own one for something this small. So piston should be in square. Put that in. I'm just gonna guide it down by hand. I've got bolts to do this, to guide it in. I usually use, I didn't grab them on this, but I'll go get them for the next one. With an impact gun. That scares a lot of you, doesn't it? I'm not actually going to impact it. I'm just going to screw it up. Okay, so there's two pistons in. I always like to roll them over. So I've put the heads back together. One of them's on the table there, completely assembled, ready to go. Had this one ready to go on the block because the parts came in from Iski and from Manton that we were waiting on. And this morning I woke up and I thought, it's amazing how much different what I'm doing to these heads and what I have done than what they were stock, as opposed to, say, a big block Chevrolet or small block. You change the stuff for better stuff like valves and springs, locks, retainers, etc. But it's not really that much different. It's stronger, it's better, it's bigger. But you set them side by side and you don't really see that difference like you do with this. So I took an exhaust valve back out of this and I was going to show you the difference. I went and upstairs and pulled a stock spring, stock valve out of stock, out of my junk. And this is the differences. Stock Hemi spring. This is the spring that's going in that motor now. So not only are you talking that height difference, look at the diameter difference. The Hemi spring would almost fit inside of the spring that we're putting in this thing. I'll set them down here on the table for an even better comparison. So the differences, and the crazy part about it, when you really think about it, I don't know how these motors even made the horsepower that they made. I'm going to give you a demonstration of that. So one other thing here. This is the valves that's in my hot rod motor. This is the stock Hemi valve. Maybe not that much difference in looks, but it really is a lot different. There's the difference in diameter, quite a bit. And there are 100 thousandths difference in length. So it's taller, it's larger diameter, and you got to make that stuff work. You have to fit that in. I've done all of this work, and I did this years and years ago. I've actually forgotten most of what I did. I cut the valve pockets out, or the spring pockets, I'm sorry. The spring pockets, I opened those up and made them deeper. I did all the porting and polishing. These old heads are pretty darn nice for a stock cast iron heavy, I might add, Hemi head. I did the O-rings. I did the chamber work. I made the valves bigger. I don't have an intake valve to show you, but it's a lot bigger. And one of the things that you do, look down in here. I'm not sure this will show up. See if you can get a view of, okay, see that chunk down in there? That's aluminum. So you block the ports off and it's inside the chamber. I don't think you'll be able to see it, but you can. Let me get a flashlight. So there's a crossover between the two exhaust ports here. See that right there? See that chunk of aluminum? Yeah, that shows up good. That's on this side as well. So that's an open passage that goes through the head, through here, and comes out of this exhaust crossover right here. So this feeds into the intake manifold, and that's ugly and crusty and corroded, but that gets exhaust temperature in there. So there's lots of ways to do that. Some people will cut a steel plate and they'll reach in there and they'll TIG or weld that steel plate into that. Well, it's cast iron, number one. You know, you'd probably be better off brazing it. Two, that's way down in there. It's really hard to do. So what I did was I made a steel plate that just fit in there and blocked that passage. It was just a little piece of steel plate. And then I stuffed it with steel wool. Just packed it in so that held that steel plate up against there on both sides. And then I fired my little foundry up and melted some scrap aluminum and poured it in this side. So the aluminum poured through, went in and sealed those exhaust ports, and I just poured it up that high. There was no need to bring it all the way up. So to get a good old Hemi head, an original Hemi head to do what you want it to do, there's a lot of work involved. One of the other things that you got to consider when you're opening up these springs, these spring pockets, let me turn this back around. you got, this is way, and I don't have a stock one to show you, but I cut it way deeper to get the installed height, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But it's also a lot bigger around. Remember that this spring here, not only is it shorter, it's so much smaller around. You can see the difference. If I take the inner out, you can really see it. So there's how much difference in. Look at those two compared side to side. So the stock one is, when it's extended all the way, it's about the height of the installed one. I mean the hot rod one is installed. So there's a lot of work. Now you got to be careful. You get that spring pocket too thin, the kind of pressure that these springs have, you can bust it right through. You know, it'll crack the head. It'll push right through. That's common on pretty much anything. But the point is that these heads require so much more because you're going from that to that big spring. So what I did was I took a head, I'd say stock, but it's not stock. I hurt a head on this motor one time. I had to build a new one. So this head here, the other piece of it, I cut it into 3 sections. The other piece has got, I don't even remember what I did. I guess I dropped a valve. It ruined the chamber. So the head was junk. So I put this in the bandsaw and I cut it right through the guides. So right in the middle there, and I cut it 3 different sections. And I used it when I was building these heads to make sure that everything was okay. So right here, you can see at the depth I'm about 1/4 of an inch. This one's a little bit thinner, maybe 220 or so, 230. This is where, when you're cutting this pocket down for the spring, which would be sitting right there, you can get into the water, which I don't have water in it, but you still don't want to get down into that. If you cut it too thin, it'll bust from the spring pressure. So I used this old head to make sure that everything was good, and for porting purposes. You can only open stuff up so much. You can see here that I'm pretty safe on this head. Everything, you can tell how thick it all is right there. So you need something to go by, because just going in there with a grinder or a spring tool to make that spring pocket deeper, you can go all you want, but if you're lucky and don't go through, you may be so thin that when you put it together and go race this thing, it busts the spring pockets out. So I've used an old head, and I've got 3 sections of it, so I pretty much know what it's like all the way through. I did this a long time ago. But I've got this thing right now, you can see on here, I've got 2020 of installed height with this on the exhaust side, and I've got 2010 on the intake side. I probably could have taken these down to 220 like the other side, but I didn't want to spend the time this go round to do that. And 10,000ths of an inch on those valve springs makes basically no difference. But I do want to show you something here. I think this is kind of interesting. So this spring installs at basically 2 inch, 2010, 2020. You can see that the height of this new spring is around 2 inch, 650 thousandths. That's free height. So compared to the stock spring, the free uninstalled height is 2010, 2020. So this spring is the free height on the stock spring is what the installed height is on the race spring. There's a lot of difference there. Give you an example here. When I put this thing in, and we'll set it at 2.0. Just trying to get to it. You want to do it over there on the table?
Yeah.
Be better. Do it here where she can record it. So this spring at said 2.0, It'll be somewhere, I think, about here. So that's 2040. Let's go just a little bit more. 2030. The handle's always in the way when I do this. So there's 2020. Look at the pressure. And this isn't necessarily what I would like to have, but that's 290 pounds per square inch of pressure at installed height. So each one of these springs is sitting about almost 300 pounds of installed height pressure. Of course, open pressure is going to be, I don't even remember what the cam is. It's going to, let's say, 2.020 minus point. We've reground this cam, and I don't know where the cam card is, but let's just say 700. That would give us a height of 1,320. Let me make sure my math is right. Yep, 1,320. So if I crank this thing down to 1,320, I haven't done this and I don't know where it's going to be. Keep going. 1,390.
Keep going.
I'm still trying to, that went a little too far. It's hard to see what I'm gripping on here. Okay, that's pretty close. 680 pounds of open spring pressure. So I think that's a little bit more than these heads were designed for. I'm going to show you an example of that. Okay, so remember those installed pressures were about 300. Here's the stock spring, retainer, and the inner spring. Now these are old. These are 1958, so they've lost some pressure, but how much? You know, not world changing. I don't know the installed height of this. I don't have a way to check that, and I don't want to look it up. But here's what I'm going to show you. Take a look at that bubble on that thing is always in the way. Let's try to get it over there. Okay, watch the spring. We'll say that installed height might have been somewhere around there. Look at the pressure. So what is that, about 80 pounds?
Something like that.
All right, so let's crank this down. Just kind of watch the whole thing. I'll crank this spring down until it almost coil binds. Almost the coils, of course, when they coil bind, I can peg the gauge out. But kind of keep your eye on the gauge and how much the spring's cranking down. So that there's, you know, that stock cam had probably 400 thousandths lift, 3 something. So I'm way over what the max lift on this would be. But look at that, you can back up, you can see the whole thing. So 180 pounds or so. Now when I get the coils almost bound right there, you're still only 200 pounds, 210 pounds. This spring here, by today's standards, would be a racing Briggs & Stratton spring, maybe not even that. They probably have more spring than that. It's crazy how much difference the parts are that made 345 horsepower. Let's look at this. So in 1958, you know, these things were the bad boy motors. These were the top fuel motors. All the front engine top fuel cars that you love to hear running on nitro, and they're cackling at the cackle fest and they got flames blowing out the exhaust. That was these, you know, this is the engine that they had in them, the first gen Hemi. These things not only look good, they sound good, and they ran super good. You know, a top fuel car in the 60s, whatever it made, 1,800, 2,000 horsepower. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I wasn't around. I didn't build them. But, you know, a good version of this on alcohol, 1,000 horsepower, that was a lot back in the day. I understand you can take a stock truck motor now and put turbos on it and make that, but you couldn't back in these days. This thing is a 1958 vintage, 57. This particular one's a 57. There's the serial number. But I'm using 58 right here. Well, here's a 57. So in 57, a firepower V8, solid lifter camshaft, 392 cubic inches, made 375 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, 420 pounds of torque at 4,000. That's interesting because that same motor in 58 made 345 horsepower, but it made 435 pounds of torque. Less horsepower, but more torque than it did in 57. So this motor made 375 horsepower. We all remember the 375 horse 396. That was a hot rod motor. You know, it was fast stuff. 1966 had 375 horse solid lifter square port head 396 in a Chevelle. That was a fast car back in its day. And people still think of that as a fast car. So do I. This motor made that same horsepower in 1957. So that's pretty crazy when you start comparing then and now. That motor was way more advanced than a 57 Chevrolet small block, you know, horsepower wise. It was heavy and it had its drawbacks, but that's why they used it so much and it dominated and top fuel back in the day. Here's something that I'm getting ready to do. Thought I'd show you the stock Chrysler rocker arms. And they were actually good. They did very well. They had an adjustable version of it that had adjusters on the pushrod side, but most of the motors, and those were like industrial rocker arms, most of the engines had these same non-adjustable pushrods, rocker arms. They had non-adjustable pushrods, which you can get adjustable push rods now, but they came with just standard push rods, and they were preset to the height that would give the lifters and that's something that makes me think about that solid lifter cam. I don't know exactly what they did. Maybe the solid lifter motors had adjustable push rods or rocker arms. I just don't know. But this motor had solid push rods, no hole in the middle, and they were non-adjustable. So other than the adjustment part, these rocker arms work very well. They wouldn't work with those spring pressures very well. They tend to break. You can see that's very thin and flimsy right there. So I wouldn't want to run that rocker arm with this, but you can run it with less than this and still make a lot of. Okay, so there was another problem, same problem, push rods. They sent the push rods just the right length, everything was perfect, except they didn't make them oil type. There's no hole in the middle of them. This motor has to have oil through the push rods to oil the top of the push rod. The bottom would oil with the lifter. The rocker arm will oil like a Hemi's supposed to through the shafts, but the top cup on these, I've got a ball on the rocker arm and a cup on the push rod, and there's no way for oil to get there without a hole through it. So we're sending back that set of push rods, and I guess they're going to rework them. So there's no push rods in the motor, no lifters. I did put a set of lifters in and a pair of push rods just to verify that everything was correct, and it was. Just disappointing that there's no hole in the middle of them, which a Hemi doesn't typically have a hole in it, but we specifically gave them, the directions to do that. So where it's at now, I just kind of threw it back together to mock it up, just to make sure I could find everything. This stuff's been off of here for a long time. I've got a combination on here that gives me 6% over on the blower. I'll probably run it 10% over. I've run it as much as 25% over. But with a roots blower, at some speed, you're just basically generating hot air. You're not really helping anything. What you're increasing in boost is decreasing in efficiency because it's just generating such hot air. So I'll probably run it between 6 and 10% for right now until we get a good tune in it and make sure it's going to work. And I did find most of my pulleys. There's one missing to come up with the combination that I used to run. Probably used it on something else and never took it back off. The headers are just on here for looks. I've got new flanges and new tubing from, not the flanges, but the tubing and the U-bends is from Speedway. And I'm going to build another set of headers, more in line with what the original car had. They just kind of pointed down. They won't swing out so wide. The fenders on this come right here, and they look really good, and they work really good, and they blow back like they should, but I just don't like the looks of them for this old car. It's going to be kind of annoying because they're going to be dirt blowers. They're going to blow dirt up off the ground, but that's what the car was supposed to have. I'm going to put it back on. So I'm decreasing the size to 2¼ inch. This is 2½ inch, and I'm going to use stainless steel, so I'll never have to worry about. This is just aluminized tube with some paint on it, and they're very heavy. So all that's ready to go. The heads are on for real. Everything's on. The motor part, it's just a matter of taking the blower and the intake off, which we need to do to put it back in the car anyway. This is too much stuff. We'll take the blower off and bolt probably the valve covers and just use my engine hoist from side to side through the exhaust holes or maybe the intake holes. Set it back in the car. Then I'll put the push rods and the lifters in the car. It's really pretty easy. I don't think you've seen it, but I can tilt the front end on that car like the 55, or I can take it off. I'll probably just take it off. So that's going to come probably tomorrow. We'll probably shove it in the car tomorrow, get the transmission in. I think we're expecting a third member here Friday, so it's almost ready to fire up. It's just days away from being back together. But this will be on my YouTube Thursday. So you'll be seeing this Thursday, hopefully, if you watch Thursday. But be sure next Thursday to go check out Alex's video. She'll have the install. She'll have it on her where we're putting it in the car and talking about what's going on, what we're going to do with it. So be sure to check that out at Riding with Alex Taylor on YouTube. So until next time, thanks for watching. It's been fun, but I'm glad it's over. I'm ready to be done with it and move on to something else. And I'm ready to see her make some passes in it. It's a fun ride. Like I've said before, 9 seconds in this thing feels like 6 seconds in that 55 Chevy. So again, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.